Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm Elizabeth Schwab, your podcast editor and one of today's hosts. I'm also a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs, from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community education settings. Today, I am joined by Christy Rodelius-Palmer and Sabrina Sanchez. This episode features the second half of our conversation with Bill Fernekes, our usual host and a widely respected leader in the field of human rights education. This is a unique opportunity to hear about his own journey, insights, and longstanding commitment to advancing human rights education in schools and communities.
So I'm curious, someone deeply involved in human rights advocacy and someone deeply involved in human rights education, how do you balance the theoretical aspects of human rights with the practical need to inspire action and change?
Well, I think there are two issues here. The first one is knowledge. To me, the public in this country is woefully uninformed about human rights. I think we have survey data to show that, but that doesn't mean they can't be educated. And I think the way you say it, the way you do it is the key. If we go out there and lecture people about what they don't know, it's going to fail. But if we introduce it like Sanders did through the idea that there are things that everybody should have to be a person with dignity, well, then I think we have an opening. And so I think that comes directly from the Universal Declaration, the idea of dignity. So I think knowledge is important, and then you can sort of build on that. So that's sort of the starting point, the theoretical, the conceptual basis. But we also have to recognize that there are real differing perspectives on the theories. And we've had conversations, as you know, about the issue of decolonizing human rights education and looking at it from different perspectives. And I think that's valuable. I'll be the first one to tell you that I really didn't consider those things at all when I started in human rights education. But we have to today because it's part of the conversation in scholarship. Despite some people's efforts to limit that, it's wrong. We should be having the broadest conversation possible about this. Audrey Osler, I think, made a very good point in her most recent book. You know, when she was growing up in Great Britain, there was no study of colonialism in the schools. Well, now in this country, you have a presidential administration that's trying to limit the study of the history of this country to eliminate what they don't like. And to me, that's a terrible thing. So one of the things that I think you can do very practically is you can restructure how you go about designing curriculum to give it a human rights emphasis. Now, some people would say, okay, why are you doing that? Nobody was talking about human rights when Columbus bumped into North America. I say, well, that doesn't mean that people didn't think about human dignity. It's in every major religion. The ethical tenets of every major religion deal with this. So we can talk about that. We can show that Catholicism, well, you know, there was a great debate in the 16th century in Spain over the question of how to deal with indigenous peoples. Well, let's talk about it. But I think we have to not shy away from the idea that we can take theoretical concepts and apply them to study the past as well as the present. I mean, my view is that, like Paul Gordon-Loren in his book, is that we have to take U.S. history, and I say U.S. history, by the way, to clarify, because too many people call it American history. It's not American history. It's U.S. history because the Americas go from the Arctic to the Antarctic. I was always a pet peeve of mine. We should be taking that lens and imposing it on there and looking at it because they do it all the time with other concepts. So why not that? And I think that's where you can marry the two. But then the other thing, Sabrina, is that it shouldn't just be in the public schools. It should be in the conversations that we have every day. And what I mean by that is that, let's just take an example. There is a shameful number of people living in poverty in this country, but nobody talks about it as a human rights issue. They talk about it as poverty. And some people believe that poverty is a problem that we have to solve by making people go to work. Well, that doesn't do anything for the child who's 2 years old who doesn't get a meal. So to me, the real issue is to start talking about public policy with the human rights lens as well. And that means we have to educate the people who are making those policy decisions and the staff members, because we're not doing a good job with that.
I think we need to listen to that. And you, Bill, have mentioned already numerous human rights education initiatives that you've been engaged in since the mid-1980s. But what initiatives do you believe have had the most impact? Or in particular, are there any strategies or tactics that you really hope that emerging human rights educators will use and adapt?
Well, I would say that the mixture of classroom instruction and activism is the one that really has great potential. I mean, the work that Pam Bruns and her task force is doing in California is really quite effective. And I think also what Karen Robeson through the RFK Center is doing. To add to that is the Human Rights Close to Home project in Connecticut. I think we should be looking at those as models, as how we can take those and replicate them elsewhere. Because if we're going to have really, I think, significant long-term impact, we have got to help young people embrace the idea and then become advocates themselves. Now, I always took the position that we can study human rights, but there can be students who disagree, they don't believe, that's fine. We're not indoctrinating anybody. We're educating them. But I also believe that by opening their minds to these other ideas, the possibility is greater than if we didn't study it at all. So I think by taking those strategies that are being tested now in Connecticut and have been done in California and have been used in other places, we should be able to develop a, for lack of a better term, a research study, a data bank, a whole series of ideas that we can use to bring to people. I mean, Amnesty did this to some degree in that human rights kit they did to make it a human rights school, right? They actually took ideas and they said, here's how you can help your school become a human rights centered school. I think we should be doing that type of thing and helping people, because not every school will become that. But if we can get one teacher in a district and then another teacher and have that develop gradually over time, that can help. But I do think that we're in a much better position than we were 30 years ago. There's a lot more information, there's a lot more scholarship, there's a lot more conversation about this stuff, even though in the big picture, we're a small group in this country. But all over the world, there are people talking about this. And in some ways, the podcast has helped because it has brought ideas to people all over the world through the evidence we've seen. I think we need to try to get those ideas out in this country in a systematic way.
Well, I'm going to add on something and hope you can share, because you've worked and actually published on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. You had a book, and currently the UN Special Rapporteur is proposing that we have a new optional protocol to that UN Convention on the Rights of the Child treaty on the right to education and thinking about education. What do you think about that idea, and what do you think, maybe it links up to some of the context you've been talking about in terms of the political context and authoritarianism, or what's being pulled out from our curriculum right now?
Well, let me ask you a question. Is the rapporteur's proposal a substitute or an addition to any statements in the convention?
I believe that right now she's open and asking for comments for the development of this new optional protocol. So it would be an additional treaty but set up as separate. But I think you could also highlight some things within the existing Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Are you specifically saying human rights education or just education, broadly defined?
I think that she is probably open on both fronts, but I think or I guess maybe this is a question back to you, is how you see both the right to education and the right to human rights education as intersecting, or are they separate?
Well, I view them as indivisible. I think if you're going to have an education that develops human potential, you have to have human rights at the center of that educational process. When Beverly Edmonds and I worked on that book, this was 1995, the convention was not even 10 years old at that time. And it seems to me that if they're proposing this, then there must be a real need, because I think there was a lot more optimism back then that they were going to be able to implement this on a broad scale across the world. And it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful that this country has never put that treaty in front of the United States Senate. It's a disgrace. We're the only country in the world that has not ratified it. So to me, I welcome this idea of the debate, and that's important, because too often I think politicians say, oh, I can't bring that up. It's going to alienate people. Well, what do you stand for? I mean, what do you stand for? Come on. Do you believe that every child should have the capacity to develop into a compassionate, effective, democratic human being, or not? And you can't do that if you don't have food. You can't do that if you don't have health care. You can't do that if you don't have shelter. I mean, there's a whole, that convention really is a marvel, because it really was done in the most effective way through consensus. The development of that treaty was remarkable. It took 10 years. And to me, it should be in every school. Every school in this country should be adhering to that, to the precepts in that document. But most of them don't even know it exists. When we had the curriculum back in 100th century, we studied that because it was directly related to the students.
So kind of moving forward a bit, thank you. What do you see as the next stage or stages in the development of human rights education now? The podcast that you helped to both vision and be a wonderful host since its foundation in February 2023.
Well, I take issue with the word wonderful. I would just say that we're having conversations and helping people bring out ideas. But I would say that there are a couple of things that we can do. We should locate and guide new hosts, guest hosts, who can bring different voices to the podcast, not only in the design of questions, but how they work with people. I would say a second thing is that this idea that Christine Aberbach brought up in the conversation we had about having dialogue sessions rather than a question answer is an interesting one. I think it could be very interesting in terms of how we approach a topic, for example. Let's just say, the conversation would be about decolonization. Well, you could have a person who's very well informed on that and somebody who wants to learn about it, and they could have that conversation. Or you could have two experts. But I think those are two areas I would work on. And I also think the third is that we need to engage more young voices. We've started it. We haven't done it as much. But I think right now we should move there, because really one of the emphases of the broadcast up to now has been to archive and get the words of people who've been in the field for a long time. But now I think we're at the point where we need to move on and gather other voices. And fourth, I think we need to broaden our focus beyond what you might say is the K-12 or university educators, deal with museum educators, deal with people who work in other contexts, and have those people on the show, on the podcast, and talk about how they connect to human rights education.
Thank you, Bill. And now, I guess, getting towards the end, Who would you say is the most influential model for your human rights education work, either living or dead?
Well, I'll give you two of them. All right. I would say Nancy Flowers uh, has always been a shining star for me. Nancy was a classroom teacher, just like I was. I met her when she was a classroom teacher in California, in Palo Alto. And then she left it and moved on to become a trainer and an activist in so many areas of the world, as well as a scholar, as well as a networker. And I think she's the whole package, let's put it that way. And putting all that aside, she's a wonderful person. And I think if you can aspire to do that and be a wonderful person, then that's a great role model. Now, one who's deceased, there's no question, Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, as a graduate of Rutgers, as I am, he's the greatest graduate of Rutgers. There's no question about it. Some people might disagree. Well, I'll give them a big argument on that. He was a remarkable human being. He was an athlete, scholar, activist, actor, singer. He was a remarkable human being, and I think he stood to his he stuck with his principles. He was a longtime advocate of decolonization before it was even popular. Back in the 30s and the 40s, he went to London in the 20s, and then he and his family moved to London, where he met Nehru, Kenyatta, and other people who were in the anti-colonial movement in Africa and India, places like that. That radicalized Robeson. And I think it was important. There was a shift in his focus. And he became a universalist rather than only focus, let's say, on African American. He was a universalist. And I admired that because I think he always believed from that point on that you can't deny anybody's rights because otherwise you're harming everybody otherwise. If you deny this group's right, then the rest, who's next? And he fought for groups that, were in many ways powerless. So we have to remember too, he grew up in segregation. He was from New Jersey, but his father had been a slave. And his life was characterized by all kinds of indignities. When he was I'll give you an example. He was the most famous actor in the United States on Broadway in the early 40s because he was on Othello. It was the first time a Black actor had done Othello on Broadway, ever. Long before James Earl Jones and others. And Robeson went to Chicago with the troupe to do it there. He couldn't go in the hotel lobby. He had to go through the service elevator to get to his room. These types of indignities were daily, right? And remember, the Jim Crow South was just horrific at that time. Just it was awful for Hispanic Americans and Indigenous Americans, right? So Robeson stood up for them. And I admire that because he suffered tremendously. He lost his passport, his health suffered, but he wouldn't give in. So I think that's a great role model.
And what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights?
Now, I was a good boy. I did my homework. Here you go. I got two of them. They're both from Paul Robeson, by the way. The answer to injustice is not to silence the critic, but to end the injustice. And the second one is, quote, I stand for truth and justice, and I will continue to speak out against oppression. I think those words are very timely. And I look at those and I say, okay, well, we need to do that. There are too many people in this country and around the world who are suffering cruelty and discrimination and bigotry, and we have to be part of the gang that says no.
Thanks, Bill. I think you might have done your homework for this last question too, which is if you had the power to make one critical change to advance human rights education in the US, what would you do?
I would require, through state action, meaning legislative action, that all teacher and professional licensure programs require the study of human rights education that must include field work, not just classroom study. And when I mean professional licensure, I'm talking about police, law enforcement who aren't police, judges, social workers, anybody who's working with other people in caring profession, nurses, doctors, everybody. Because I think if we just focus on classroom teachers, we get a small bite of the big pie. Because one thing that somebody once told me, and they were right, if you think about the time that you're in a public school, from the start, the child arrives, let's say 7:30 in the morning, leaves at 2:10. They're out of association with you more than they're in. They're in the hall, they're in the cafeteria, they're walking to school, they're on the bus, wherever it's going to be, right? Well, we have a very limited contact with them. The rest of society has more. Well, then let's work on that. I mean, think about it. If a person goes for medical care, you would hope that they would be treated with dignity. I don't think there's a lot of doctors, physicians, nurses, or assistants who study human rights education. They may study ethics, but how do they know what it means as a human right? So that's part of my argument.
Oh, we're just all so very thankful of your leadership, Bill, and being here and being able to have us interview you on your many years of service, activism, and education in the field of human rights. So thank you so much. And we hope to hear you again on a future podcast.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, send them to chrissy@hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernekes, executive producer Christy Verdelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hins, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizuz-Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.